Dr. Noa Lincoln is Kanaka Maoli and Kama'aina to Keala Kekua on Hawaiʻi Island. He completed his formal trainings at Yale and Stanford universities, and he has worked across the Pacific Rim on ancient and contemporary indigenous agriculture. He is currently a professor of indigenous crops and cropping systems at UH Mānoa, a farm owner at Malakalu Ulu Cooperative, and an agricultural advisor for multiple local agricultural organizations, and a board member of many Aloha Aina organizations as well. So we're very honored to have you here with us. Thank you so much for bringing your wisdom and your experience to this Pau Hana presentation. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Noa Lincoln.
So yes, aloha, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here over from Hawaiʻi Island, moku o Keawe, and came tonight to share both about breadfruit and actually share breadfruit. So everyone who came today as part of indulging me in my talk, you are rewarded with a ulu sapling to take home and to grow your own ulu. And hopefully after the talk today, you will be excited and inspired to go home and grow your own ulu once you learn a little bit more about it. Today we want to share a little bit about ulu, about breadfruit in our Hawaiian food systems in the past, in our present, and also thinking forward about the opportunities and what the future might hold for ulu. If anyone's never seen me speak before, I'm a very informal speaker. I'm a casual speaker. So certainly if anyone has any questions or thoughts or comments as we go through, please don't hesitate to make yourself known. I'm happy to indulge questions, go off on tangents, and all of that good stuff. So feel free. Just like to start a lot of my talks with this olelo no eau, ancient saying, he li'i no ka aina he kaua vale ke kanaka. The land is chief and the people are merely servants. And to me, there's a lot of ways to interpret this olelo no eau. Tonight, I am just not going to read into it. I'm going to let you take it for what it means to you. But just something to ground us a little bit and to keep in the back of our minds as we go through tonight, help us think the ways that our ancestors thought about ourselves and our land and the relationship between us. Okay, so we'll start in the past. Does everyone know breadfruit? Oh, pretty much everyone. Couple don't. All right. Well, we'll go through the first couple slides quick then. So for those of you who do not know breadfruit, it is a large perennial tree in the fig family, the Moraceae family. Grows in the tropics, and most notably produces some very large carbohydrate-rich fruit, very dense in starch. And as we'll talk more about later, importantly, it's one of the few staple crops on the planet that grows on a tree. When you think about pretty much all our staples, right? Rice, wheat, corn, potatoes, sweet potatoes, quinoa, teff, anywhere you go in the world, it's almost all annual crops. Very, very few staple crops that grow on the trees. There's some examples from the First Nations people in North America, like acorns and pawpaw, but not many around the globe. And it's a really unique trait that, again, as we'll talk about later, offers some very unique opportunities for breadfruit. So a brief history of breadfruit. Breadfruit is the human-developed cultivar of bread nut. So the mo'okuauhau, the ancestry of breadfruit, is from the bread nut. And bread nut originated in the Borneo, Papua New Guinea region. And it's a large spiky fruit on the far left here. And it's kind of hard to see, but in that lower left image, you can see in the sliced fruit, it's full of seeds. When you cut it open, there's about 60 to 80 large quarter-sized seeds in there. And it is an edible fruit. A lot of people do use bread nut around the world, but they don't eat the flesh of the fruit. They actually let the fruit fall and rot, and then they go and they pick up all those big seeds, and they boil the seeds, and they actually eat the seeds like a chestnut. High in protein, makes a great hummus. A lot of dishes are made out of bread nut. So in Papua New Guinea, which has been inhabited by humans basically since Australia, since the land bridge existed between Asia and Australia, people were traversing back and forth, the ocean rise, people got stranded up on Papua New Guinea, and they lived there for tens of millennia, 40 to 50,000 years people were in Papua. And as part of that, they began utilizing bread nut and selecting bread nut to be a better crop. And so slowly in Papua New Guinea, they were starting to develop breadfruit, a fleshier, starchier bread nut. The problem is, in Papua, bread nut is everywhere. So as you're trying to grow your breadfruit, all this bread nut pollen is flying around in the air, and it keeps back crossing. So you could never really get too far away from that wild ancestor. And then about 4,000 years ago, as our ancestors' seafaring knowledge improved, and they were building better va'a, bigger va'a, they learned the stars and how to navigate better, and they started sailing off into the Pacific. And they started settling the near oceanic islands of Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu. And of course, they took their proto breadfruit with them. And then when they get to Samoa, Tonga, Vanuatu, and suddenly they're away from bread nut, no more bread nut, that's when breadfruit truly proliferated and became its own thing, became a new crop to humanity. And you get in the Artocarpus altilis, in true breadfruit, you start to get fewer and fewer seeds. You start to get more and more flesh, and you start to actually eat that flesh of the fruit rather than the seeds. And as they island hopped across the Pacific, and they keep taking their favorite variety with them, by the time you get to Eastern Pacific, Tahiti, Marquesas, and eventually Hawaii, the breadfruit's been so selected. They're essentially a seedless, sterile crop, much like bananas. They can't propagate by themselves anymore in the Eastern Pacific because they've been bred to no longer have seeds. And that's the crop that our ancestors eventually brought into Hawaii and used to support some of our food systems here. There's tremendous diversity. Yes?
So if our breadfruit doesn't have any seeds, where do the seedlings come from?
Seedlings it's the wrong word. They are saplings. They are baby trees, but they are not derived from seeds. We can talk actually about how these specific trees were made. But most commonly, traditional propagation is that breadfruit is a very shallow-rooted tree. So they send out these surface roots, and every once in a while along the roots, they just throw up a new shoot. And if you don't do anything, it develops into a new tree, and then you have two trees next to each other. But if when that shoot is a baby and you go and cut out the root, you can move it around, take it with you, put it on your canoe, go to a new island and plant it and get a new tree that way. Yeah.
So it sounds to me essentially like you're just cloning in the sense that you got the same tree. So how long ago did they cease to interbreed them? Because I would expect then you have all the breadfruit around are the same tree.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So as you go from Papua New Guinea to Hawaii, it's a really beautiful gradient. So each island you go to, they will have fewer and fewer seeds until you get to Tahiti. And for instance, there's one variety in Tahiti that still makes seeds. And they actually call it huero, which means seeded. They do eat it too, yeah. Yeah, and we could get into a little more detail because there is actually two different processes. There's breadfruit that have been selected to not have seeds, but they're still fertile. In their physiology, they're still sexual. They could still make seeds. They're still a diploid plant, and under the right circumstances, or maybe every once in a while, every 1,000 trees, it still makes a seed. But in that process of cloning messes with things genetics a little bit. So as they started cloning their favorite varieties, they also caused the genetic defect that created a triploid breadfruit that's truly sterile. It's infertile. It can never make a seed no matter what. And so there's seedless varieties that are fertile and seedless varieties that are sterile. Yep. Yeah. And there's actually two pathways to triploides, which is another thing because there are two varieties of breadfruit. We looked at the Pacific pathway. There was another pathway of bread nut that went up through the Philippines and into Micronesia, and that's another species, Artocarpus marianensis. But as it came down through Micronesia, Marianensis and Altilis started to overlap, and you got interspecific hybrids that also created sterile triploids as well. So there's actually two totally separate pathways to sterility. Yeah.
Any idea what the original disperser of the breadfruit?
The pollinator, like what moved the seeds? That's a good question. I don't know. I do know in Samoa their huge bats that they call the flying fox they love breadfruit. But I don't know if they eat the seed and redisperse them or that's a great question, but I do not know. Yeah.
What is the center portion of the ulu called? Because you see the seeds on the sides of it, and the center is what?
Yeah, so that is we call it the core. And so I wasn't going to say this, but breadfruit, the fruit itself is really interesting. So when you look at the fruit, this isn't the best picture to see it. Maybe on this one you can see it well. You see all the little hexagonal components? In the center of every one of those hexagons is a flower. So the fruit is actually not a fruit. It's actually called a syncarp. And it's composed of like 500 flowers that fuse together and make the fruit. So the core is actually like the stem of the flower, and then all the flowers come off the stem. And then the flowers kind of fuse together to make the flesh of the fruit.
Okay, so I had ulu. Mm-hmm. I mean, where you have the stem and the seed like one down there.
Yeah.
And I thought you said that usually they don't have seeds in it if they come from the same tree.
Well, so as you got to the end of the voyages, after selecting all the way across the Pacific, then you get the seedless varieties. But if you go down to Samoa, Vanuatu, they're all seeded, mostly all seeded still. Yes, yeah. Which is mostly is the Ma'afala, which is a Samoan variety that was introduced. Yeah, but the Hawaiian, the Maoli variety is truly sterile and will never produce seed. Yeah, so Hawaii actually has a pretty good breadfruit diversity. There's a botanist, Wilder, who you guys all know Wilder Ave. That's who it's named after. He brought in about 32 varieties of breadfruit in the early 1900s from the South Pacific. And they were introduced originally to Big Island, but they got spread all around. So a lot of times we get trees that even people think, oh, this is an old Hawaiian variety, and we go look and it's, oh no, it was an introduced Tahitian variety or introduced Samoan variety. So there is quite a bit of Pacific diversity of breadfruit in Hawaii. Yeah, including a lot of seeded varieties. Yeah. Yes.
So that brings up the question in historic Hawaii and Samoa, is there was an inter-island interaction. Did they trade breadfruit even back, you know?
Okay, we're going to hold that question because I do kind of get to that. Yes, yeah. I'm not denying your question. I'm delaying it. All right. I love it, though. Great questions, everyone. This is good. So yeah, from that process of island hopping, lots of varieties were developed. There's something like 850 documented names of breadfruit across the Pacific. Our rule of thumb in ethnobotany is usually it's about 2-to-1 names to varieties, because a lot of times a variety gets multiple names, different places, things like that. But still suggests that there's upwards of 300, 400, 500 varieties of breadfruit across the Pacific. And they differ in texture and shape and size and growth patterns and all sorts of ways. So traditionally, breadfruit was a really important food source across the Pacific. And in particular on the older islands, places like Marquesas, the Marshall Islands, the old atolls, you didn't have what Hawaii has, right? We have these young, beautiful, sloping volcanic plains that, we can grow vast areas of sweet potato and kalo. If you go to Marquesas, it's these steep, old, eroded cliffs, and then there's a little bit of coastal flat, and then these huge lagoons, But they didn't have the same opportunity for agriculture as we did here in Hawaii. And because of that, on a lot of these islands, breadfruit is the core staple, the dominant staple of these islands. And much like Hawaii, was cooked in a lot of simple ways. Still, the most popular in a lot of groups is pulehu, where you literally just throw the whole fruit right in the fire. The skin chars, it seals all the moisture inside the fruit, and it bakes, but it kind of steams in there. And then you crack it open, and very good, very good. Yeah, ulu poi, very popular in a lot of places. Niu, coconut, is the natural sister crop to breadfruit. Almost every breadfruit dish will have niu or coconut milk with it. But importantly, for these islands that were dependent on breadfruit, is unlike kalo or uala, breadfruit it's a tree, so it's also seasonal. And that you do go through a time of plenty and then a lean season. And they had to come up with ways to store breadfruit, both on an annual basis to get through the lean season, but also on an interannual basis. So when you have a good year, you need to store up for the bad year when the drought comes and your trees aren't as productive. And so breadfruit fermentation is a really big thing throughout Polynesia. And this is kind of a home pit. They would be little, like 3-foot wide pits, about 3 foot deep. You take your ulu, you peel it, you core it, you soak it in the ocean for a few days to salt it. And then just like sauerkraut, right, you can it up. In this case, you would line your pit with tea leaf or banana leaf, put it in there, bury it, make it a nice tight seal, and just like kimchi or sauerkraut or anything else, it ferments, a lactic acid fermentation. Your pH drops, and then it preserves the food in these underground pits. So this goes by a lot of names throughout the Pacific, ma, or kon, but very, very common. And in the Marquesas, or places where there were large populations dependent on ulu, there's pictures I've seen of pits in the Marquesas that are like 15, 20 feet across, like you're talking like a couple dump truck loads of ulu that would just fit in these pits, and they have these massive fermentation pits. And this is something we're really working to bring back today as like a nice, home preservation method. A lot of the Micronesians who practice this today, they've adapted it for modern usage, right? So to most people, they just use 5-gallon bucket, You salt your ulu, you put it in there, seal it up, boom, you get your fermentation. I've even seen guys who do it in Ziploc bags in their pantry, and it's like, oh, that's really cool, you know. But yeah.
Is that like turns to alcohol for them?
No. Yeah, it doesn't go alcoholic. It goes past alcoholic, I guess. So just like kimchi, it actually goes vinegar, right? So it gets a little bit of that sourness, that vinegar to it. So when you open up the pit, at first it's like, woo, you know, there's like a wave of you know, like when you open up your kimchi the first time, it's like, woo, you know, and then it kind of airs out. But then you take that out, you rinse it, you wash it, and then they re-cook it. And at that stage, it's like a dough. It's like, I mean, it's really like a dough. And you go throw it on top the imu, and it rises, and it's like, it's really good, actually.
Do they make flour out of it?
Traditionally, not really. The closest things, they do make kind of a biscuit. So they would pound poi, and then kind of air dry it, and it would turn into a biscuit. Or on the voyages, for the voyages, what a couple elders have showed me, so they salt it, they pound poi, they mix it with the coconut milk, and then they lay it out on challah, long leaves of challah, and then they air dry it or sun dry it. But because they put in the coconut milk, the oil, it doesn't dry like a biscuit. It dries like almost like a fruit leather consistency. And then they roll up the challah, so you get one big roll, and it's like fruit by the foot. Yeah, you unroll it, and then you have your ulu fruit leather, and it's a little bit sweet because of the coconut, and really high energy, right? Because you have the fat from the coconut, and then all the starch from the ulu. And that was one of their core voyaging foods from some of the Micronesian islands. Yeah. Okay. So here in Hawaii, like I said, we're a little bit of an outlier in the Pacific. You know, Hawaii is the largest. We're the tallest islands in the Pacific. We're the only island group north of the equator. We are among the youngest of all the island groups. And because of that, we have really different opportunities for agriculture that don't exist in our South Pacific cousins' homelands. And so breadfruit a little bit took kind of a different role in Hawaii. It never became the core staple that it did elsewhere in the Pacific, you know. And if you ask most Hawaiians, like, oh, what's your favorite starch, right? It's usually kalo, uala, ulu, in that order, you know. And so ulu, yeah, it's there, but, you know, if we can get poi, we go and eat poi, you know. And let me just skip through these couple. So ulu was important. It was widespread. Let's do a question.
I know what kalo is, I know what ulu is, but uala?
Oh, sorry. Uala is sweet potato. Yeah. So in particular on our younger islands of Maui and Hawaii, there were areas that were very sweet potato dominated. You know, Kula and Kahiki Nui on Maui, Kohala and Ka'u on Big Island were very Uala-centric peoples. But ulu was widespread. So this is just kind of a very brief hand-drawn map from a kind of review of a lot of our mo'olelo, our old stories, kind of talking about where ulu was grown. So the darker the green is kind of, the more ulu, you know, was in that area. And then our stars are areas that were famous for ulu, really famous breadfruit belts. And so here on Oahu, Waimanalo in particular, you know, you get the steep puli, and then you have that slough at the bottom of the puli, those colluvial slopes. Those used to just be solid ulu. All along those bottom slopes of the puli. But yeah, so To illustrate, I guess, the role of ulu in traditional Hawaii, I'm going to share about one particular ulu planting, and that is the Ulu of Kona. So the leeward coast of Hawaii Island. And there's a very unique planting scheme in Kona. So as you go up the slopes of the mountain, you go through very different ecological zones. Your rainfall increases. So down along the coast, you have the lowland Kula plains, which are very dry, used for resource crops like pili grass, ipu gourds, hala, niu, things like that. And then above that, you got into this breadfruit zone known as the Ulu, which some elders have told me is a contraction of Ulu, which literally means the breadfruit grove. And then above that, you had the Apa'a. And this was kind of the really intensively farmed area where you were growing your kalo, sugarcane, bananas, yams. You had a lot of walls and infrastructure. You were really investing in that system because the Apa'a is really what fed Kona. And then beyond that, you had another zone known as the Ama'u, which was a kind of plantings within the native forest. But to go back for a second, this is a drawing done by one of the daughters of a missionary in 1827. So looking up from Kailua Bay in Kona, and you can see that breadfruit belt depicted kind of cutting across the slope. And it's a little hard to see, but above that, she has all the walls of the Apa'a zone sketched out there where they were growing the large gardens. And I became really fascinated with this belt as part of my dissertation work. It was 18 miles long. So from Honaunau in the south, all through Kona, up to Ka'upalehu in the north. So 18 miles long, but only about a half mile wide. And just this narrow band of breadfruit cutting across the whole landscape. And I was just like, why? Like, why is it there? Why, like, right there? Why only a half mile wide? Like, what is going on here? And to leave you in suspense, I'll take a question.
So, the elevations of, did you show that in the other picture? I don't remember.
So not really. The elevations do differ a little bit. So it does follow the rainfall a bit. And as you go north in Kona, as you start hitting Hualalai Mountain, the rain band starts to curve up and around the mountain. So the further north you go, it's actually a higher and higher elevation. And then in the south, it's a bit lower. No, that was that was a really intensely researched piece. Yeah, yeah.
Is this banding common throughout all the islands, or is this Kona specific?
It's a bit Kona specific. For instance, we did a lot of work in the Kohala system, which is right, up the coast from Kona, and there, what you see in Kohala is what I would call a temporal division of the system. So in Kohala, you have all the same infrastructure from the bottom to the top of the farming area. It's all the same walls, the same mounds. But when you look at the patterns and you read the old stories, what they did was move around that system through the year. So they followed the rains up, and then they followed the rains down. So in the summer, when it was drier and warmer, they planted higher in the uplands. And then in the winter, when it's wetter and cooler, they would plant in the lowlands. So it was spatially, it was all the same, but they divided it in time. Whereas Kona, it seems like they cropped it all year long, but you had this spatial division of the ecosystems. So yeah, I think you get a lot of place adaptation as you go from one place to another. So we haven't quite seen this same terminology applied to anywhere else in Hawaii.
So even the other, sorry,
No, go
Like
ahead.
the other like big ulu growing areas, they didn't follow this.
Yeah. Yeah, because like in Waimanalo, you couldn't go above that, right? Like you had that colluvial slope and then, pully, right? You know, you can, I don't know what you can plant there. But yeah, so I spent several years actually just looking into the kala ulu of why it was there. We started recreating pieces of it, looking at its productivity. Just to do a quick summary of some of the things we found, but over about that's equivalent to about 10,000 acres in Kona. They produced on the order of about 18,500 metric tons of breadfruit out of that system every year. Meaning you could feed about 15,000 people just breadfruit, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. A lot of breadfruit. But importantly, when we, well, I don't know if it's important or not, but one of our interpretations as we really started to be like, okay, why? Why was it here? There's a lot behind this, but these are the big take-homes. The reason they did the kala ulu here was largely an environmental consideration. You know, in Kona, we have really young flows, lots of rocky soil. And when you look at where it is, it's in that mesic zone, you know, so you have the dry plains above it. You have the wet agriculture above it where you have really good rains, but that breadfruit belt was right in the middle. And what that means is that if there's a limit to how much rain you need to grow kalo, on a bad year, that area goes below it. And a good year, it goes above it. And then above, below, you know. So if you're cropping kalo in that zone, it's a really, you know, tenuous operation. You know, some years you'll get a harvest, some years you won't. And so they took advantage of this kind of, you know, marginal landscape and be like, well, we can do something that's going to be more stable, more productive over time, and take some of that risk out of our farming. When we look at the lower limit of the kala ulu, that's a hard environmental limitation. It just got too dry. And when you look at that lower boundary of the kala ulu, it perfectly follows the rain line as you go up around Hualalai, and it beautifully follows the rain line. And basically, cannot grow. We're done. Just to finish this last one. But when we look at the upper edge, we really couldn't come up with a good reason. They could have kept cropping ulu. And in fact, ulu gets more and more productive as you go up the landscape. And the only real explanation we could come up with was a preference. We like kalo better. And as you go up the mountain and it gets wetter and wetter, you're able to crop kalo really successfully. And so that's what they did. Once they got out of that marginal zone, that little half-mile wide belt, they're like, oh, we're going to do what we want to do. We're going to grow kalo. So at the end of the day, this was our explanation of why this little skinny half-mile wide belt across the landscape. And there's no time to go into it, but there's also a really fascinating story about how the extent of that breadfruit zone aligns with the political units of the region. And it seems really obvious that belt was strongly connected to political economy. And when we look at our mo'olelo, there's pretty good suggestion that this breadfruit belt was inspired or maybe led by Umialiloa, the famous farmer chief of Hawaiʻi Island. And again, ulu wasn't a staple. They didn't need this to feed the people of Kona. You know, they were feeding the people of Kona with the apa'a. And it seems that this breadfruit belt was kind of, the little extra icing on the cake that allowed our ali'i and allowed the political powers that be to acquire more force. And in particular, and we don't have as much supporting evidence for this, but my thought is that a lot of this ulu went to feed pigs. And you could store the ulu, because forgot to mention that we do not get the fermentation pits in Hawaii. Our ancestors weren't storing ulu the way our cousins were in the South Pacific. But I do think they were storing it in pigs and growing pigs. And then pigs were a powerful political economic tool of the past that could be traded and gifted, for a dowry or for an exchange of property or people. And so to me, breadfruit in our Hawaiian history is a very political component of our trajectories here. Okay. This is going way slower than I thought. It is. So one of the ways we identified the extent of the breadfruit belt is we ran up and down the mountain and mapped all the old breadfruit trees we could find. So much of what was the breadfruit belt is now the Kona coffee belt. But you'll be going through a coffee farm and there'll just be this huge old ulu, or any of the little ravines where they couldn't bulldoze and they couldn't crop coffee. It's all ulu in those little spots. So there are remnant trees still on the landscape, yeah.
Your political pig interpretation, is that hold outside Kona? Because there are all these other spots with stars.
Yeah. Yes and no. And that's some more nuanced conversation. So maybe we'll hold that one. So I can quickly get through a big part of what I'm really passionate about. But, so what is the role of ulu today and into the future? And I'm going to pick it up here because I'm probably going to start getting stink eyes on the time. But we all know, right, our local food system is horrible, that we import 85 to 90% of our food. But it's actually a lot worse than that when you look at it categorically. So if you break it down into categories, we actually don't do horrible on our fresh fruits and vegetables. We actually produce about 60% of our fruits and vegetables locally today. So baby cucumbers, right? Mushrooms, camuela tomatoes, we're doing okay. When you look at starches and carbohydrates, we produce less than 0.5% of our carbohydrates locally. And when you talk about food security, that's what feeds people. That's what keeps people going. That's our energy. That's our base caloric intake that people need to survive. So from a food security perspective, we're doing way worse than 15%. We are like 99.5% food insecure on our starches. And when you look again at our, the food pyramid, this is what it looks like in terms of what we produce. So very unstable pyramid there. So Ulu has tremendous opportunity. We've done a lot working with farmers and mapping trees to understand the habitat suitability of breadfruit, where it can grow, how productive it can be. And there's tremendous vast swaths of land that we can grow breadfruit in Hawaii. And luckily that has been the case, or at least in terms of people starting to grow momentum in that area. So this is from some farmer surveys we've been doing. And this is just showing the number of trees on farms over the last 20 years. And you can see that we've been having an exponential increase in people planting ulu and growing more ulu on our farms. And the potential for ulu is amazing. Right? When we look at our traditional consumption, it's largely in that mature stage, that, kind of peak starch stage. But because ulu's a fruit and it ripens, it goes through a bunch of different maturity stages. So people use the baby breadfruits when they're only like baseball size, and they taste more like a vegetable at that stage, kind of like an artichoke heart almost. And people are making pickles and poke and salads out of those things. And then the fruit grows and it gets starchier, and then it's more like a potato. And at that stage, you can just do a million things with it, right? Chips and hummus and chowders and curries, and anything you do with a potato, you can do with a breadfruit at that stage. But then it continues to ripen, and a lot of those starches converts to sugars, and it sweetens, starts to turn into something more like a sweet plantain. And people are using it at that stage in desserts and drinks and sauces. And so it has tremendous culinary potential that the surface is just getting scratched. These are some products that people are actually making in restaurants or on the shelves. Ulu Mana has this Ulu hummus up in the corner. The Hawaii Ulu Co-op makes a Ulu chocolate mousse down in the right there. Chefs across the state are using it and incorporating it into their cuisine. So two more things just about the opportunities. The opportunity is not just for Hawaii. And when we look at the global cultivation potential of ulu, of breadfruit, and you overlay that, where can breadfruit grow and where is the world's hungry? So this is a global hunger index on the right and a breadfruit suitability on the left. And it's not perfect, but there's pretty good overlap of where people need to improve their agriculture and their food supply and where breadfruit can grow. And so the Breadfruit Institute has been on a 20-year mission to kind of help get breadfruit out to impoverished countries around the world as something that can make a real significant impact on livelihoods and well-being across the globe. In fact, the UN about 5 years ago declared breadfruit one of the top 35 underutilized crops on the planet, something that they declare there needs to be a global investment in this crop because of its extreme potential. And then finally, again, is that breadfruit is a tree. And, the world has been taken over by a, very Eurocentric concept of agriculture and food production that involves tilling the land and intensive alteration of the landscape, intensive inputs to produce high-yielding grains. But, prior to the 1500s and the large, exodus out of Europe, most of the world did not prescribe to that form of agriculture. A lot of production was in things like agroforestry, in tended wilderness, in systems that let the environment and the ecosystem do much of the work for us. And we would go and reap the benefits. So when we start talking about things like climate smart agriculture or carbon negative agriculture, or all these things that relate to the environmental and social sustainability of how our globe grows our food supply, again, breadfruit has tremendous opportunity to transform the form and function of how we grow our food. And these trees, in addition to carbon sequestration, tend to have higher nutrient and water use efficiency, tend to have higher biodiversity associated with them, tend to have higher soil health, higher microbial and fungal diversity. And so there's a whole host of benefits we can get from trying to rethink our food systems, and in particular, rethinking them around the inclusion of trees. And breadfruit there has tremendous, tremendous potential. And so I leave you with a very cute picture of my son, and, for the future. Yeah.
There's certain types of marketable crops that pair well in an agroforestry system.
That is probably one of the biggest questions we get from our farmers. We are doing a lot of work with that right now. Some of the suggestions we say now, one is think temporally, right? So breadfruit's a seasonal crop that has a lot of production, in July to November. So a lot of our farmers, not a lot, but there are a few of our farmers who grow a lot of like turmeric and ginger, because those crops you tend to harvest in January, February, plant in March and April. And then that kind of offsets the ulu season in terms of your labor and what you need to do on your farm. There are a number of shade-tolerant crops. We have been increasingly partnering with mamaki growers, which is another, I would say, kind of burgeoning industry, or industry on the verge of burgeoning, that utilizes a traditional crop. But mamaki is a successional plant that's very shade tolerant, so it can grow really well in mixed systems with breadfruit. There are pretty shade tolerant varieties of kalo. This is our farm, Malakala Ulu, and so we grow shade tolerant varieties of kalo kind of right along the edge of the drip line with our ulu, and that works really well. But yeah, it really just depends how you design the farm. Things like spacing, pruning is a big one. How you prune your trees. So for instance, sugarcane, very, very not shade tolerant. Typically would not work with ulu. But at our farm, what we do in terms of pruning is sometimes we'll just cut down the whole tree. Instead of just pruning a little bit every year, you go back and you just hack the whole thing way back. And what you do is you expose a big light gap. And then for a year in that light gap, you can plant more sun needy crops. And you get one crop, and then your ulu refills out, and then you kind of move over and you do it to the next tree, the next tree, the next tree. So you can kind of move around by defoliating your trees and then letting them recover from that. So I think there's a lot of options. The thing is, we've invested so little into thinking about alternative cropping systems, right? We've just gone down the road of high input monocrop grain is the way to go. And so I think there's a lot to be learned in that arena. And I think we're seeing more and more attention and investment in that area too.
So if you cut the ulu back down, it'll grow.
Oh yeah, grows back fast too.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yeah.
It can probably have more branches.
Yeah, exactly. So you want to preserve the structure. Like you don't want to stump them, but like he'll have his main trunk and then like maybe the main 5 or 6 branches, and you leave like 2-3 feet on each of those, and you just take all of that. So it looks like a hat rack when you're done. Yeah, and then that's a good shape, and then he bushes out from there, and yeah.
Do you have any go-to resources or websites to recommend for cooking at home?
Yeah, there's a few. So the Ulu Co-op does have a lot of consumer resources. So they are eatbreadfruit.com. The Breadfruit Institute has quite a bit, and I think they are breadfruitinstitute.org, maybe. There is, I'm not going to know their name, but there's a number of really good resources out of the Caribbean, because there's a very strong breadfruit culture up there as well. There's a lot of like breadfruit hip hop songs that you might like. Roast or fry, roast or fry. Yeah. It's awesome. If you want to laugh after this, look up roast or fry. Yeah.
If you have a tree, is there a lifespan, or it just comes up in roots and the big one will die? So you basically have an immortal tree, or do you one wither?
That's a good question. One that I don't think is totally answered, but the original tree that Captain Bligh took to Jamaica and planted in the Jamaican, what is now the Jamaican Botanical Garden, that same tree is persisting through its root runners. So the main tree has died, but yeah, it's self-cloning. And so, yeah, I don't know if that can go on forever, but it can go on for at least 200 years. Yeah. Yeah. Nice. In the back.
How resilient would Ulu be to some kind of genetic disease if there's not that much genetic diversity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there is good genetic diversity across the Pacific. But yeah, when you get into the sterile clones, yeah, they are clones. There have been some massive Ulu die-off documented. So in the late 60s, early 70s, there is a Pacific-wide disease called Pinglap disease. And on some islands, it's estimated to have killed like 90 to 95% of the trees. There was another big outbreak in the Caribbean later. I think it was like the mid or late 80s. And Jamaica at that time had an estimated 2 million breadfruit trees. And again, it wiped out like something like 85 or 90% of them. So yeah, that's a good point. There is certainly that danger. And one of the things, I mean, we're really trying to do now is to get more varieties available to farmers. Because they're mostly cloned, it's hard to get large numbers of trees quickly. So when a farmer wants to put out like 10 acres of breadfruit, wants to buy 500 trees, it's really hard to get that. And so what they do is they end up going to a tissue culture company and they get all of one variety. And then you're exposing yourself to that susceptibility that you've raised. But yeah, there are some examples that did not bode well in the past. Yeah.
I have two questions. First, what did the nuts taste like?
They taste a lot like chestnuts, I would say. Yeah.
Two, this is really self-serving. I'm a teacher, and I teach aquaponics, and we do like native growing plants and trying to spread it around the school. Would you be willing to talk to a middle school?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we definitely do a lot of outreach and stuff. And the Ulu Co-op had a grant a couple years ago, and they worked with the education department at UH, and they developed the Ulu Education Toolkit, which I think is like K to 6 maybe. And they have lesson plans for every grade and relate them to the teaching standards and all that stuff. So that's available as well, just as a resource. Yeah. Yes.
Asian Hawaiians, did each island develop its own kind of breadfruit? Because they were isolated from each other. I know there's inter-island travel, but you still had kingdoms pretty separate from Hawaii.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So first, I would say it seems very clear that Ulu did not make it here on the first va'as to come. Yeah. And I mainly say that, like, of course they would have tried to bring it. It was an extremely important crop. You wouldn't go voyaging without it. But when you look at all the mo'olelo about Ulu in Hawaii, they universally talk about somebody leaving Hawaii and getting Ulu. So most literal, there's this, I wouldn't even call it a story, but there's a history of a chief named Kaha'i who sailed to Apolu. There was a famine. He said, "Oh, we need breadfruit." He sailed to Apolu, got breadfruit, came back. I mean, that's the whole story. But there's like also more kind of mythical stories. There's a story about a little boy who climbed a magical coconut tree, and the tree was so high it bent way over, and he climbed and climbed, and he landed in Kahiki where he found breadfruit and came back over the coconut tree. There's stories about fishermen who were caught in a bad storm, and their boat sunk to the mythical undersea island of Lono, where they received Ulu and brought it back. So there's a bunch of mo'olelo that talk in one way or another about people leaving and coming back with Ulu. And that kind of jives with the archaeological record as well, which suggests that ulu might not have been present until about the 1200s in Hawaii. More directly to your question, so when you go to Samoa, like they don't even say ulu, right? They refer to all the different varieties. You know, they're like, oh, ma'afala, you know, maopo, hamoa, you know, avaloa. Like they talk about the varieties. When here in Hawaii, you know, that's not the case. They do just essentially refer to it as ulu. And that has been used to suggest that there was only one variety of ulu in Hawaii. The more that we've really looked and, you know, gone and collected specimens from like way in the back of different valleys, you know, that are almost guaranteed, you know, pre-European varieties, we do see a fair bit of variation. Whether that variation represents multiple introductions or, like in the case of a lot of our other crops, represents varieties developed in situ, developed here in Hawaii, that remains unclear, I would say. So I don't have a definitive answer there. But my sense is that there were multiple different, you know, things that were different enough that our ancestors probably would have considered them different varieties. Yeah. Okay. Nice. Yes, Rose?
No, from the Mahalo that we've known, they've got a complementary project. A lot of the stories relate to famine and saving people's nutrition. What about current and future climate change and drought tolerance with ulu? What do you think about ulu and Hawaii's going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, trees, you know, again, are more resilient, you know, to variations in weather. You know, in general, trees are more efficient in terms of water usage. So yeah, I mean, I think they have tremendous potential to play in the future of climate change, you know. And what kills me, right, is that, you know, USDA is giving hundreds of millions of dollars to corn research to develop corn varieties that are going to be more heat tolerant, right? Because the Midwest is going to warm and, you know, we need corn that can survive higher temperatures, ignoring the fact that we have tropical crops that are already suited to those environments. And if we invested in those crops, it's probably a much lower hanging fruit to use them to adapt to some of these future climate scenarios, instead of, you know, working on genetics and intensive breeding and still doubling down on this singular concept of grain crops as the only crops that can feed the world. So we're working to change that. Yeah, one step at a time. Okay, last question, and I know we're way over time, so then I'll be hanging out. We can talk story. Depends how you prune it. If left unmolested, you know, the trees can easily reach 80 feet height, and, you know, a canopy width of you know, 25, well, canopy radius, so I guess full width of like 50 feet. Yeah. And then they are, again, tend to do surface roots. And so those roots can go out about 80 feet. So yeah, you don't want to plant them like right next to your sidewalk or house foundation. Yeah.
Can they be stunted? Like, can you just put them in a pot, like kind of keep it nice and contained, and then they would still produce fruit?
Yeah, you can. We've gotten trees in pots to fruit. And if you're on it, I mean, if you prune them every year, like you can definitely keep them pretty compact. If you do take a tree tonight, we did bring 2 varieties. So the ones in the larger pots are Ma'afala, the Samoan variety, and that is a little bit more of a compact variety. And then the ones in the dibbles are the Hawaiian, the Maoli variety. And that's a little bit of a lankier and a larger tree. Yeah. So I got to do it. Here are funders. They've given us money over the years. We appreciate them and supporting, our work and, a lot of people's great work. We've had a number of awesome students who have helped over the years and worked, and definitely want to acknowledge them as well. And this is my contact if anyone wants to follow up on anything such as teaching classes. Email's the best way to get in touch. Yeah. My farm is in Ke'e. It's in South Kona. So actually my farm is right in the heart of the old Kona breadfruit belt. And so our farm is restoring, we're trying to restore, that traditional system as best as we understand it. Both as a research endeavor, as a kind of educational endeavor, because we have all these kids from Kona and they go to like Hawaiian studies, right? And they get shown like, oh, here's a lo'i system, right? Flooded kalo, and kids in Kona are like, I've never even seen a river, like much less so that's not what their ancestors were doing. So we wanted to help recreate systems that represent their history and their, mo'okuauhau as kind of reference systems that they can connect to. And then, of course, to produce food as well as another main part of it.
Do you have a food preference?
In terms of the variety or the...
Is there a different flavor in any of them that you notice?
So to me, the varieties don't differ in flavor, but they really differ in texture. So like if you have like an Afara and a Ma'afala that are the same size, like the Afara is like almost twice as heavy. So the denser varieties, they're better for things like chips because you can slice them really thin. They're better for poi. Like if you take a Hawaiian ulu and you throw it in the blender with like some olive oil and tahini, you get poi. If you take a ma'afala and you throw it in the blender with olive oil and tahini, you get like a hummus, So the textural differences make a big difference.
What is the name of the Hawaiian?
So elsewhere in the Pacific, they call it maoli or maori. Yeah. Which means, right, like basically true or original. And so some argue that was the original seedless ulu.
And in Hawaii, what do they call them?
Just ulu. Yeah.
We hear Ma'afala is Samoan.
Yeah. Okay. Well, sorry for going so long. Thank you, everybody.